You already clocked it before anyone else said a word. The way she smiled slightly too wide when she heard that name. The way he checked his phone right after saying he wasn't worried. The small exhale someone tried to pass off as nothing. You didn't comment. You filed it somewhere quiet and kept going. This is not a superpower. It's not a personality type from a quiz. It's something that developed slowly, in specific rooms around specific people. You learned that speaking first often cost more than it returned. So you stopped being the first voice. You became the first pair of eyes. And people mistook your silence for emptiness. That's the part nobody tells you about. Other people assume the quietest person in the room is either bored or nervous. Neither is usually true. What's actually happening is closer to a kind of continuous low-frequency scanning. You're tracking tone before content, posture before words, timing before meaning. Someone says they're fine, you notice they didn't finish their coffee. Someone says the meeting went well. Their jaw is still tight after they say it. You're not trying to catch anyone out, it just happens without permission. The pattern recognition runs in the background like something that was never turned off. There's a specific type of childhood that produces this. Not necessarily a dramatic one, sometimes just a room where the temperature changed fast. Where you learn to read the silence between sentences as its own kind of data. Where the wrong word at the wrong moment meant something unpredictable followed. So you got good at waiting, at watching, at measuring before committing. Not because you were told to, because it worked, because it kept things manageable. And a strategy that works at 9 years old doesn't disappear just because you're older. It becomes the default, the lens, the first thing you reach for in any room. This is where it gets interesting and slightly uncomfortable. You know things about people that they haven't told you directly. You've noticed the friend who laughs louder when they're actually struggling. The colleague who gets quieter right before something breaks down at home. The family member whose sentences get shorter when they're building toward anger. You've been collecting this information for years without being asked to. And here's what most people don't examine. What do you do with it? Some quiet observers become the most trustworthy people in anyone's life. They sit with what they see and use it carefully when it's actually useful. They notice you're off, and instead of making it a thing, they just stay nearby. They don't announce what they've observed. They simply act on it with quiet care. That's a particular kind of emotional intelligence, low noise, high signal, but there's another version, and it's worth being honest about. Some people who notice everything start to trust their interpretations too completely. You observe something, and before any conversation has happened, you've already decided. You've written the explanation, assigned the motive, and settled the verdict. In your head, it's fully built, a logical architecture made from real observations. But the observations are accurate. The conclusions are sometimes fiction, because noticing behavior is not the same as understanding the whole person. You can see that someone is distant. You can't always see the full reason why. The overthinking that often partners with quiet observation does something specific. It takes real data and fills in missing pieces with the most plausible feeling story. Not always the most accurate one, the most emotionally convincing one, especially if your history has taught you that distance usually means something bad, or that quiet people are angry, or that warmth followed by silence means rejection. Your pattern recognition is reading the present, but it's running on old software. And that's not a flaw in your intelligence, it's a flaw in the update cycle. The observations are sharp. The interpretations are running through an older filter. One that was calibrated in rooms that don't exist anymore, around people who are gone. There's also the question of what the silence costs socially. People who talk less are often liked, but not always understood. They're described as mysterious, deep, calm, sometimes all three in the same breath. What they're rarely described as is fully known, because observation is a one-way mirror if you never let it run both directions. You see clearly, but you've made it structurally difficult for others to see you back. Someone asks how you're doing, you give them the short version. Not because you're lying, because the full version feels like too much exposure. Because somewhere you learned that being readable made you vulnerable. That if people knew how much you noticed, they might become self-conscious around you. Or worse, they might start performing for you instead of just being themselves. So you keep the observations private and the interior life behind a door. And the door makes sense. But sometimes it stays locked longer than necessary. The social exhaustion is real, but it comes from a different place than people assume. Most people think quiet people find social situations draining because they're introverted. That's part of it, but it's also the processing load. When you're tracking subtext, body language, tone shifts, and conversational undercurrents, you're running significantly more cognitive work than it looks like from the outside. You seem relaxed. You're actually cataloging. There's a difference. By the end of a dinner, a meeting, a party, you haven't just been present. You've been working, quietly, invisibly, constantly. And here's something most quiet observers don't fully credit themselves for. You are often the person who prevented something before it became a real problem. You noticed the friction building between two people 3 weeks before it exploded. You clocked the lie in a business conversation that everyone else took at face value. You saw that someone was about to break down in a public setting and quietly shifted the room. Nobody saw you do it. Nobody thanked you for it. You didn't expect them to. That's actually the whole point of how you operate. But there's a cost to being the person who sees and rarely speaks about what they see. You accumulate. Observations stack. Quiet conclusions compound. And sometimes what was meant to be temporary restraint becomes permanent withdrawal. You stop saying what you notice not because it's not relevant, but because you've become so accustomed to processing alone that sharing feels foreign. The muscle for expressing what you observe internally, it gets stiff from underuse. You'll know this feeling. A conversation where you had something real to offer. A moment where what you noticed could have changed the direction of something important. And you held it, said nothing, stayed in the observer position because it felt safer. Afterward, you played the conversation back in full. You always do. You saw exactly where you could have spoken. You saw what it might have changed. And then you filed that too, in the same quiet archive where everything else goes. This is worth sitting with honestly. Observation without expression isn't wisdom. It's sometimes just postponed loneliness. The person who notices everything but shares nothing ends up feeling invisible. Not because they're ignored, because they've built their life around remaining unseen. And invisibility feels like safety until you realize you're also invisible to the people who'd stay. There's a version of this pattern that loops into something heavier. You notice people drift or disconnect, and instead of asking what happened, you observe quietly. You build the explanation from behavior alone. You decide you already know the reason. You protect yourself from the conversation by having it entirely inside your head instead. And the relationship fades not because of the original distance, but because of what you did with it. You diagnosed it. You concluded it. And then you grieved it without ever testing the assumption. That's not observation anymore. That's avoidance wearing observation's clothes. And it's worth calling it what it is. Not to be harsh, but because it has a real cost. The cost is connection, specifically the kind that requires you to be seen in return. There's a misconception worth correcting directly. People assume that those who talk less are simply more comfortable with silence. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes the silence isn't comfort, it's armor. The quiet isn't because you have nothing to say. You have more to say than most. It's because somewhere the calculus became, speaking risks more than staying still. And that calculus made sense once. It doesn't always make sense now. The sharpest observers are often the worst at asking for help. Not because they're too proud. Because asking requires admitting uncertainty. And admitting uncertainty feels like handing someone information they could use against you. You've watched people exploit vulnerability in others. You filed that observation too. So you carry things alone for longer than is reasonable or good for you. You solve problems quietly. You absorb difficulty without distributing it. And you do this with such consistency that people genuinely don't know when you're struggling. Not because they don't care, because you've made it nearly impossible to tell. Here's what this pattern has been protecting, underneath all the watching and the quiet. A version of yourself that got burned by being too open in the wrong room. That spoken was dismissed. That shared and was mocked. That trusted and was used. The observation became the shield. The silence became the strategy. And it worked. You protected that version of yourself successfully for a long time. But a shield carried for years starts to feel like part of the body. You forget it's something you're holding. You think it's just who you are. The difference between someone who is naturally observant and someone who is defensively quiet is not always obvious from the outside. It's not always obvious from the inside either. Sometimes you won't know which one you're doing until you notice how you feel after. If the silence leaves you feeling clear and grounded, it's probably your nature. If the silence leaves you feeling unseen and slightly hollowed out, something else is happening. That feeling is information too. You're usually good at reading information. One small, honest shift, if it applies. You don't have to share everything you notice. That was never the point. But once in a while, let someone see what you actually observed. Not as performance, not as a demonstration of how much you've been paying attention. Just as a moment of contact. A signal that there's someone behind the quiet. Because the people who notice the most have an unusual ability to make others feel genuinely seen. And that ability only fully works when it moves in both directions. A brief note before this ends. This video is for reflection and honest recognition, not a substitute for professional support if what you're carrying has become too heavy. You walked into rooms for years and read them before anyone else did. You caught the things that slipped past everyone else's attention. You held more than you were asked to hold, and you did it quietly, without complaint. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. But you are also allowed to be the one who gets noticed sometimes. You are allowed to be the one that someone else is paying close attention to. The observation doesn't always have to move in one direction. And the silence, when you finally decide to break it, tends to be worth the wait.